Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Russia has threatened military retaliation, claiming that a British warship got too close to the coast of Crimea in the Black Sea. There is a massive NATO exercise there as well right now. So why is the West seemingly willing to consistently poke the Russian bear in an area where it has troops and where there's been international condemnation of its annexation of the Crimean peninsula? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Well, there has been condemnation, yes, but little else. So do both sides see this as what's called gunboat diplomacy? Or is there the possibility of a dangerous escalation? The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, has accused the UK and the United States of military provocation after manoeuvres by the British warship HMS Defender in the Black Sea. Neither side disputes that the ship sailed close to Crimea, the territory annexed by Russia in 2014. The UK said the Defender was making a lawful passage through Ukrainian waters. Russia said the ship had been chased out by its armed forces and released pictures of it being tracked by sea and buzzed by fighter jets. Russia conducted live fire drills in the area recently, at the same time as Ukraine and NATO forces carried out exercises nearby. So, how dangerous is the Black Sea right now? And are we witnessing a fight for influence in the region? And we go first to Ukraine, to the capital, Kiev. And there we see Alina Frolova from the Center for Defense Strategies in Ukraine. She's a former Deputy Minister of Defense for the country. And then to Portsmouth, UK. And we welcome back Professor Peter Roberts, Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute, Rusi. And once again, we say hello to Robert Fox, Defense Editor at the Evening Standard. Peter, let me ask you first of all, what is the scale of what's going on in the Black Sea with Western warships and why?
I think the interesting point about this is there isn't that much difference from the level of activity that we might see in the Baltic, for example, or in the Norwegian Sea, or perhaps in the Arctic, or even in the Pacific with regards to Russia. Sometimes we forget that it has all these coastlines and all these areas, and it does the same activities in most of them. So is this so different that we're seeing off Ukraine now that perhaps we've been seeing in the Baltic? Well, it's not in terms of some of the electronic warfare, the jamming, the spoofing, the moving of ship signals about. But is it different in terms of the interaction with ships? Well, yes, it is. And this is an interesting part of the whole process. It's not something that we're seeing replicated perhaps in the Black Sea, in the Baltic Sea, but we are seeing it in the Norwegian Sea. And we're certainly seeing the same level of reaction and activity in the Pacific, where perhaps we've not recognized it before. So, for example, the largest deployment of Russian warships in some years is now quite close to Hawaii in the Pacific, conducting live fire exercises that we wouldn't necessarily recognize as something that has been the normal program of events from the Russian Navy for some years. So unusual, yes. Unprecedented, no.
Okay, Robert, I was going to go to you, Alina, next, but I want to go to Robert on this one. What is the reason for this?
I think the reason why we're paying attention to it is good old theatre and showbiz. We've had some conferences in which Ukraine and Ukrainian territorial integrity has been mentioned, from the Biden-Putin meeting in Geneva. We've had G7. We've had the NATO summit. The British defence and strategic policy is a bit like the plot of a Pirandello play. It's lots of bits and pieces in search of an author, in search of a purpose. And so that's why we got the incident, which I think was largely to be expected and overplayed, involving the destroyer Defender touching in on a piece of territorial waters on the west of the Crimean peninsula, which the Western Alliance, of course, says is Ukrainian territorial waters. And of course, Russia responded beforehand. And I think we're getting a lot of focus. There's a lot of burn and churn. And I think all sides rather like it. I wonder whether my two colleagues would agree with it, because it's focusing attention there. I think with what we just heard from Professor Roberts referring to what Russia is up to, I think it's a bit of a conjuring trick. And as you know, the great success of a conjuring trick is misdirection. Yes, things are tense. Yes, there has been a standoff with all kinds of powers, including Romania, Ukraine, and so on across the Black Sea. But to go back to my main motif in this, it's rehearsed. People know the rules of the game. For goodness sake, when he was blowing off about HMS Defender coming within 3 miles of territorial waters, Putin was not threatening world war about it, and he expressly said so. I think it's a bit of a diversion. It's a fascinating contest, but it's one of many, as Professor Roberts has described.
Well, you mentioned Vladimir Putin, what he said about world war. Let's hear it in his own words.
You have said that the world was on the verge of world war. Of course not. Even if we would have sunk the ship near Crimea, it is unlikely that the world would get on the verge of World War III, because those who do it know they cannot emerge the winners of that war.
And Alina, what he says is, you've said the world's on the verge of a world war. I don't believe it. And Robert Fox has said some other countries in the region might be enjoying the theatre of all this. Is that the case in Ukraine, or is your country rather nervous?
Well, I would say that we are quite happy that some events are happening, because before Black Sea region was out of the context and out of the focus of international key players. And actually, part of these scenarios we were prognosing last year in our researches and in new research this year. So the scenarios were well played, and we expected. So we are glad that our partners, let's say, did not step out, but rather demonstrated that they're in and they're starting to pay more attention to the situation. So it's difficult, but we're living in difficult situation all the time. And from the point of view of the focus and attention, that's good for Ukraine.
Yeah, paying some attention now, but for a long time it's been off the agenda. You speculate about why now?
Well, that's different factors, I think so. From the Russian side, this is they started like a big play trying to get attention of new administration a few months ago with this escalation. They also tried to change viewpoint of some European countries. So actually they reached their targets for this short period. But at the same time, they still plan the exercises for the autumn. Do not forget about this. They already put much more troops and vehicles in Crimea and along the other borders, including Belarus, for example. And they also have an election in autumn, and that's usual behavior for them before election, to start to demonstrate some kind of small war or big war, and to have these like enemies on their board. From the point of view of international players, finally, I would say that UK probably is looking for the new influence in Europe because of the Brexit, which plays good for Ukraine. And we also have like a raised concern of all those Black Sea countries, and all this together played good for us in this situation.
I'm going to
domestic agendas.
Sorry, Peter. Yeah, carry on.
Domestic agendas play hugely into this, and it's not just Russian or the appeal in Ukraine, for example, but in the UK. This is a way that politicians will underwrite a sort of more aggressive, more Elizabethan, perhaps, sense of foreign policy. It really is a sense of people upping the agenda. But I think, a bit like Robert has said, we need to be really careful that we don't over-egg this in terms of thinking that there are dangers of escalation where we might reach a tipping point. I mean, there are very clear precedents for how militaries and political leaders use escalation. And it's rare that accidental escalation involving military forces do become something of a flashpoint and expand a conflict. So I think we just need to be careful in how we talk about it, that we don't over-egg potentially what potentially is something that is very effective and useful for all of the parties in a domestic political sense.
Alina, I believe you think escalation is a possibility. I will come back to you in just a moment, but because I don't want Robert to feel like we're leaving him out at this particular moment, I'll ask you to try and explain some tactics here. And that is the reason why it's felt necessary for either a Royal Navy warship or a US warship to sail in what Russia believes to be its waters. It's trying to stop that country being able to legitimize its claim to that area. Is that correct?
We have to go back a long way. Because it's a question of the militarization of the Black Sea, which I'm sorry goes back to the Ottoman Empire and to particularly a treaty we begin with in 1831. And then the thing that really colored a lot of what military naval power could be run across the Black Sea is the Convention of Montreux of 1936. As an extension of that, for example, that there is an understanding that external navies, that is navies that are not part of resident powers on the Black Sea, can't run aircraft carriers up and down, although this becomes a matter of dispute. What we're seeing here is an exercise by Russia of a very well understood doctrine, which is called area access denial. This is a sphere of interest and influence of the Russians. And you keep out potential hostile, potential aggressive forces. And that's where I agree with Alina that there's a possibility of an escalation. And I think if there is an escalation, it'll be an accidental one. But this was flagged up as recently as the Geneva meeting between Biden and Putin. Putin specified this. And there's a fascinating thing in his opening, in his very accomplished presentation to the media afterwards, in which he started talking about the high Arctic and how this was a new maritime aspect of Russian influence and power. But he mentioned territorial waters, and he mentioned Russia's absolute sovereign right to number 6, interior seas. And I thought, is he going to go on to spell them out? And I suspect the Sea of Azov, somewhere in the Putin mind, is part of that. And the Sea of Azov, to go back to Alina again and to what Peter has been saying, that this is one of the things where I think there is great potential for accident, because the hidden hand behind the great theatrical gesture of what the Royal Navy did with HMS Defender was the agreement. And the agreement is that the UK will help build up the Ukrainian Navy with some frigates or corvettes. They're going to sell 2 mine hunters from the Navy to them, and build up naval port facilities. And in the discussions, we know Azov was mentioned, where there is the key port of Mariupol. So there is some real hard sense, there is some real hard power influence at the bottom of this.
Let me try and summarize just a little bit. So the Royal Navy goes into Odessa on basically a trade mission, and as it comes out in a second maneuver, it goes close to Crimea. The Russians say, you've come far too close to us. In fact, you're in our waters. So the Royal Navy goes in, ostensibly, Alina, to say, actually, you can't claim them as yours, and it's a continuing historical back and forth. Now, my question to you is, why do you disagree with Peter when you say you're concerned about escalation?
Well, anyway, we will have another escalations in the nearest future, because we do expect the Crimean Platform Summit, for example, in August, which Russia started to threat already many countries, trying to keep them out of participation. So, and we predict some other events. But I would absolutely agree that this is not about the Black Sea and not about Black and Azov Sea. This is about the bad behavior. I mean, that Arctics and all the other regions, like using of Crimea for deploying troops to Syria, common exercises with Egypt, location of military bases in some other areas which can be used from the Black Sea or from the Crimea. That's all the bad behavior, and that's not about only the Black Sea. And I think that this is the issue which we need to be more focused, because if you do not stop them in one region, yet they will act in other regions.
So are you suggesting this could perhaps be the Sarajevo moment, the Franz Ferdinand moment, that is the spark that starts something bigger that gets out of control?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think so, and not only I think so. We just spoke not so. If you pay attention to the composition of the exercises which are now in the Black Sea breeze, so you will see Japan, Australia as a participants, for example. Ask yourself why they are there. This is not about the Black Sea, but this is about the same problem which they see in their territories. Promoted not only by Russians, but by some other countries which very specifically observe what's going on in Crimea, what's going on in the Black Sea, and they make some conclusions whether they allowed or not to act in a such way.
Okay, it's not just HMS Defender. We've got a NATO exercise out there. Peter, I'm coming to you. Operation Sea Breeze goes on till late in July, and this is a NATO statement. NATO does not and will not recognize Russia's illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea and denounces its temporary occupation. NATO continues to operate in international waters, and the alliance's actions are always defensive in nature, proportionate in posture, and in line with international laws and conventions. I'm wondering if what we're seeing is this big NATO exercise coming about in the way that it has done because of these troops that the Russians have either moved in and then moved back and moved back again. Some estimates of 150,000 troops on the Ukrainian border and in Crimea. What's your estimation of why this is happening?
I think it's part of a continuous active presence by Putin and the Kremlin to demonstrate that they have some strength, that they retain some power. The deployment of the 58th Army Group a couple of months ago down to Crimea, that probably was only about 20 to 30,000, but in many ways looked like 100 to 150,000 troops. Was very interesting. Is this a direct result? Well, no, it's not. NATO is I'm afraid nowhere near as flexible or agile enough to generate something that fast. I think it is important that NATO and those other countries that Alina talked about, the Australians, the Japanese, because this is all about what the Allies are talking about in terms of a rules-based international order, a largely mythical, theoretical set of behaviors that the West likes to believe exist and that have governed the world since the end of the Second World War. Largely those rules that suit the Western construct of how people should behave in the West, and they don't suit powers such as Russia or China. I think, to me, this was a separate incident, both the NATO part and the Russian response. Russia, in many ways, is trying to rewrite those rules in the same way China is trying to rewrite them in the China Seas. And in this, we are seeing some tensions. This is about how great powers do compete and contest with each other. When they rub against each other, there are going to be points of tension. There are going to be interactions. But I do not believe, certainly with Russia, that these are points at which we're going to see uncontrolled escalation.
Okay, you don't believe it'll be accidental, but Robert, I think you said you believed it could be. So what kind of spark might set this off?
Well, to go back to, the Sea of Azov was the Kerch Strait incident in 2018, where there's a bridge built across the strait, which has access to the Sea of Azov, and it was again another theatrical performance. It was blocked off by Russian shipping, and they tried to stop Ukrainian naval vessels going to Mariupol. It's that kind of thing. But I am very much with Peter on this, in that I don't think there will be a deliberate escalation on the part of Russia.
But what kind of thing could go wrong, even if it's not deliberate?
Oh, just a small incident, a spark like that. But I think that I was just going to make the point, I don't think Russia will accelerate it, because I think Putin's Russia and his armed forces have simply got too much on their plate at the moment, including within the region that we're talking about, namely Ukraine, Donbass, so on, and the wider Black Sea area, including Georgia. We've got to take that into consideration, and Moldova. They're all points where there could be a little spark. But come on, David, we're not going to have global conflagration, I'll get that out, according to railway timetable. the view of the way the mechanism worked, which generated, as you say, from the Sarajevo assassination to World War within weeks in 1914. I really don't think we're there at all.
And it's because neither side can afford it. I mean, whether it's economically or militarily, it's just not foreseeable. And the reality is that accidental escalation doesn't normally lead to a deliberate or even an inadvertent growth into some kind of large war. Now, deliberate escalation, I think, is foreseeable on the world stage, but not regards to Russia, but with regards to China, a different question entirely.
And another program, Peter, and another program, not this particular one.
But there's a very useful point here. Is that
right? It's entirely related to this.
I think it is. It's about both the rules-based order, but this is the kind of rehearsal incident for which the West needs to be prepared, for which China and the PLA could well use as a way of escalating the situation the way they want. Now, given that Defender and some of the other ships that are attached to NATO at the moment will be going with the UK Carrier Strike Group out to the Indo-Pacific and experiencing pretty much the same tactics in use by the PLA Navy and the Chinese Air Force. You can see these tactics being used out there, but potentially in a deliberately escalatory manner. That's why this is important. It's
I do totally understand that it is interwoven, but I'm simply saying that we don't have time to go into too many details of that on this particular programme, which is only about 6 minutes from the end. So I'll come back to you, Alina, in Ukraine. Yeah. I know you're dying to say something.
I would like to point out that we are already in the middle of the global war. I mean that the warfare just changed. No one is using just only open military conflict. But I think that this is the difference, that many European countries still expect that the war, this is just like a military escalation. It's not. And we are suffering from this hybrid approach, and we understand how harmful it is from all points of view. And not less harmful than just military escalation. If we say about for example, Black Sea, Russia needs only few hours to completely stop commercial routing there. And that's the question, whether this is war or not. I mean that, or if they will attack our ships, which will try to make a gas elevation in our controlled territories. Is this escalation or not? From our point of view, this is all escalation.
How do you go about diffusing all of this, Alina?
Well, we have three ways. We perfectly understand that we are not capable to defeat ourselves only by ourselves. The international support and our intensive work at international arena to form the coalitions, small and big, and coalition of the Black Sea states. This is one approach. Another approach, of course, we need to modernize as fast as possible our armed forces, because we need to be strong enough to bring a lot of harm to Russians. And they perfectly understand this, because even when we have a weak army, the total resilience of population did not allow them to go further.
Which may account for the sales mission of the British Royal Navy when it went into Odessa. Look, we've got about a couple of minutes. I'm going to give you a say, Bob, because I know you wanted to say a few more things, but time is our enemy.
I think that this is just one of many incidents, and this is the way that it will go. But I couldn't agree more with my two fellow panelists, because I think this is part of a bigger picture. I think Ukraine is seen as a tripwire, but it is about the rule of law and the way Russia and China, and much to Russia's reluctance, I suspect, it is now bound almost hip and thigh to the destiny of China and how they see the territorial imperative of guarding their territory. I detect in both capitals, Beijing's and not Moscow, more than my colleagues perhaps, a great deal of nervousness about this. Things were not looking good for Putin 6 months ago. He's being confident, perhaps overconfident now. But in the next few weeks, a few things could go wrong, and he could do something really silly with a diversionary, feint, or offensive somewhere.
OK, very quick one. Peter, do you want to follow up on that? We've got about a minute. If he does try and engineer something, where would it be? here?
This is a contest of wills between political parties. It doesn't necessarily use military forces, although they're a part of it, but it is something akin to we had around the 1910s, 1920s. It's economic warfare. It is political warfare. It is information warfare. And when we think about warfare, we think about the two mechanized divisions that we call hybrid warfare in Ukraine. That is part of it. But it is also, as Alina said, it's about the economics. It's about society. It's about governance. It's about organized crime. It's a very clever way of misdirecting and then achieving your ends through asymmetric means, not necessarily the direct confrontation that we have romanticized as warfare for the last 70 years.
It's also about being able to sleep at night, which I'm not sure I'll be able to do after listening to you three. Thank you very, very much indeed. I only wish we'd had time, Peter, to explain what you meant by spoofing at the very beginning. If I could just summarize, that's where the Russians put out GPS coordinates suggesting that troops and ships were in different positions to the ones where they were, which is becoming a bit of a trick all over the place. Listen, thank you very much indeed from Ukraine. Peter, we thank you from the south of England. Robert, out of London, hope the hay fever gets better. We appreciate your time, even with the sniffles. Thank you very much for taking part in the programme, and wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable, we thank you most sincerely for giving us your time and your patience. From me, David Foster, from the Roundtable team, it's goodbye for now. Do join us on another occasion. Until then.